I hope you really found that last panel interesting. It was very personal, and that's part of what we're hopeful for today is to hear some personal stories along with policy and context. And I would encourage, we're seeing some really great tweets, and we would encourage you to tweet and tell folks about what's happening here and let folks know the importance of this topic. This panel is a very interesting panel and one very close to Babbitt Center's heart. And you're going to hear a little bit more about policy, but policy from experts. And so I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa Ruiz. She is a professor of practice at the Cronkite School. She was formerly a nightly news anchor, and so quite able to handle all of our rowdy gentlemen on the panel today. So I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa and let her have at it.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and represent the Cronkite School. I'll briefly introduce our distinguished panel. So joining us right now, we have Stu Pineglass at the end there. He is the retired water resources specialist for the city of Westminster, Colorado. Next to him, Andrew Fahlund, senior program officer for the Water Foundation. And next to me, we have Jim Holway. Some of you may know him. He is the director for the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And what we will be hopefully focusing on and talking about more in depth is linking land and water in the Colorado Basin. So in this session, we're hoping to explore the water management frameworks in several basin states and a community's innovative efforts to address the Colorado River Basin water sustainability through that critical interplay of land and water. So again, something really easy and something easy to digest and fix, something that people have found multiple ways to deal with, right, gentlemen?
Right. Yeah.
By the way, I was being facetious there. So we'll get straight to it because I know that individually you have prepared some brief presentations for the audience. So I'll let you take it away, Jim.
Okay. So we're doing sort of the lightning talks here just to get us started. So in Arizona, we adopted a Groundwater Management Act in 1980. You heard a bit about that. That was something we adopted while Bruce Babbitt was governor. And then I spent much of my time in the state agency administering it. At the time it was adopted in 1980, it was clearly the most comprehensive Groundwater Management Act program of any state, and arguably still is. What you see on the slide here are some of the other actions that have been taken before or after to sort of enhance the programs. And then in terms of what the primary things were that drove the adoption of the act, you really see three primary drivers there. There was a recognition that Arizona was seriously overdrafting its groundwater. There's a famous picture showing Luke Air Force Base 15 feet lower than it used to be because we took out the water, the grains compressed, and the ground sank. So there was a recognition that we were overdrafting. There was also the Secretary of Interior at the time, Cecil Andrus, basically told Arizona the whole rationale for getting the Central Arizona project is that it is to replace groundwater mining. Prove to us it isn't just a new supply for growth and will in fact replace groundwater mining, and that was a driver of the adoption of the code. Now the part of the history is that Cecil Andrus told us that because Governor Bruce Babbitt asked him to tell us that. Classic good cop, bad cop. And then the third one that was cited is in southern Arizona, we had an area where the mines were pumping water in a basin and taking up over the edge of the basin to use in the mine. The farmers sued them and won. It was the same place in which the city of Tucson was withdrawing their water. Those who studied the history most will tell you that was the main driving act. The cities and the mines were not going to allow to stand, that agriculture could prevent them from moving water. Led eventually to the development of Arizona's Groundwater Management Act. In terms of what it did, the basic framework of it was, one, it was regulatory, and that was quite a leap for Arizona, which generally was not in favor of regulation. It was a very strong regulatory program. You know, a famous quote from it was, hell if we're going to pay farmers to raise martinis in La Jolla, as in we're not going to pay farmers enough for their water that they can move to La Jolla and San Diego and raise martinis, and we chose a regulatory approach instead. Another fundamental choice was, are we going to manage statewide, or are we just going to manage particular regions? The choice was, we're just going to manage in particular urban regions and the rural parts of the state where, no, you are not coming here. And that's an issue you'll hear Bruce Babbitt talk about in the Landlines interview. So once we decided it was going to be regional, and we created local advisory councils who was going to be local control or state. It was clearly state controlled. The local boards were just advisory. And Arizona has this dichotomy between groundwater and surface water. The law does not recognize the interconnection between them. That's not uncommon. And the choice was made that we're going to leave it that way. As opposed to Colorado, where a fundamental choice was to rework the laws and make them work together. And there's certainly reasons for that. And a classic thing you do with an act like this is you grandfather the existing people and you regulate the new people. That's kind of what Arizona did as well. What the picture shows you here is 5 active management areas. We created 4, and we eventually added another one. We had these irrigation non-expansion areas. The basic framework was statewide, very little requirements on water. A few have been added over time, but still not many. We created a few things called irrigation non-expansion areas, just new ag land. And then the active management areas, and you're in the middle of the Phoenix one here, is where the regulations were the most significant, and they are fairly significant. The basic idea is we're going to try to reduce demand, and we're going to try to move people from groundwater to start using renewable supplies. It was a series of programs over 10-year phases to do that. The dominant goal was to be at safe yield by 2025. Again, we were writing this in the late 70s. That was forever into the future. It's not so far in the future now, and it's basically acknowledged that none of these AMAs are actually going to get to safe yield. Primary agricultural program was no new land can come into production, and the land in production will get more efficient. On the city side, it was a gallons per capita per day requirement. There are some alternatives, but the real kicker then was what was called the show me the water or water supply rules. And what they basically said is you cannot develop any new land if you cannot prove a 100-year supply of renewable water to serve that land. And there's some loopholes in that, but those have basically stood. This is a figure from the State Department of Water Resources. The top line is showing between 6 and 8 million acre feet the water use in the state. So you see it's climbing into the 1980s, the peak for agriculture, and then it's declining. The bottom shaded is the economic income, the gross income in the state, and the other red line going up is population. The basic point being our economy and population have boomed, our water use has declined. Certainly the Groundwater Management Act can claim some credit for that through increasing efficiency, and also changes of economics, changes of behaviors and attitudes with people being more efficient and doing xeriscape instead of grass lawns. The primary factor here is we were growing houses instead of growing crops. That's mostly what's happening here. And 1980 was the peak of agricultural activity. So I'm just going to wrap up here with a few real quick points in terms of lessons here. So one of them was, what's the most appropriate level of governments to put some of these programs in place? And what I would say is, if it's something like a short water supply, you can't build a house if you don't prove water. That kind of has to come from the state. Very few local governments could sustain that kind of regulation and the pressure they get on it without it being mandated from above. When it comes to things like conservation requirements, I'd say the closer you are to the user, the better you are. So the local water provider, the local land use planning entity together are a much better place to put those in place and carry them out, I think, than the state level. I will stop there, and maybe some of this will come back as questions so I can rotate to my partners here.
Thank you, Jim. And now we have Andrew Fahlund, again, Senior Program Officer with the Water Foundation.
You can start. Yes.
So, thanks very much for inviting me here today. And I'm going to talk to you all about an issue that is really a third rail issue in California. I think it's a third rail issue in a lot of places, so please don't tell anybody that I said any of this. That there is some connection between water and land use, because that's heresy, even though it's completely obvious. So I'm going to talk about a perspective or an experience in California that's actually happening today, that it actually follows on to the work that happened in Arizona back in 1980. And you heard a little bit about this in the last panel that Kirsten James shared. But California, and much of this actually is implemented and is taking place outside of the Colorado River Basin, but nevertheless, California is a Colorado River Basin state, so there you go. in 2014, right after the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act passed, Felicity Barringer, who's a reporter for the New York Times, and I were on the phone talking about this, and she was writing a kind of a post-mortem on the whole thing. And she said, you know what's really exciting about this? I get to use the word historic. She said, my editors won't let me use the word historic in any story because it's just too hyperbolic. But in this case, I get to use it. So she was quite excited about that. It gives you a little bit of perspective that the New York Times got to say that. But people have been trying to regulate groundwater in California in earnest since 1914. And there have been multiple attempts and a lot of failures. This is probably the biggest reason why we were able to do that, and that was the crisis. And you don't really have to understand the map to just look. It's getting red really fast over time, and over a couple of just a handful of months, we were in a real crisis. But in addition to that drought crisis, California had what was an invisible chronic crisis that was taking place with groundwater levels declining steadily since the 1920s all the way to the present. And that's that graph on the left where the level of groundwater was going down. And then this map on the right shows where actual land subsidence was taking place in the Central Valley just during the last drought. The historic land subsidence in the Central Valley is in excess of 30 feet. And many of you have probably seen pictures of a guy standing next to a telephone pole, the top of which was where the land used to be. So there was also a great deal of attention paid for the first time in anyone's memory where the public was getting exposure to all of this. And there was nearly daily news stories happening that were profiling various aspects of the drought and particularly the urgency to do something about groundwater. So just really briefly, what is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act? What does it do? This is a map of all of the basins in California that are subject to the Groundwater Act, but the ones that are in orange, light orange, and yellow are the ones that actually have to develop plans. So that represents about 90% of the groundwater that's pumped in the state. So it's not a substantial number. It's a substantial number of the basins, but it is an overwhelming amount of the water. And so it empowers local agencies to take on most of the decision making. It then requires the development of plans that have to then be evaluated by state agencies. And the state acts as a functional backstop, a regulatory overseer of the plans to make sure that they're done on time and that they're done to ensure sustainability. So how is this a land use tool? Well, the Act actually explicitly precludes the idea that it's a land use tool. People went out of their way to institute language in there that it would not be a land use tool. Now, there are some elements of it that do say that there has to be close coordination with land use, that there has to be a fallowing program, but then you get to this last part and it basically says nothing in here shall supersede the land use authorities of counties and cities. But the fact of the matter is, it is a land use tool. The decision to cap the amount of groundwater that can be used in a basin is going to necessitate land fallowing in some basins that are that is going to amount to as much as 500 to 700,000 acres of land retired over the next 20 years. That's a substantial amount of irrigated land that's going to go out of production. And that's going to have pretty big impacts on the economy and the society of certain regions of the state that are going to be affected. It also is going to have a big effect on how cities and grow or don't in many parts of the state as well. So there's a lot of activity going on we could get into in the discussion period about how this is going to unfold. But a lot of the Water Foundation's focus and the focus of our grantees is, are we going to have a picture of land retirement that looks like this, where it's a patchwork, where it actually can contribute to significant impacts to agriculture and the environment? Or could we maybe start to shape it and manage it in a way that looks a little bit more like this, where it's a bit more intentional, where we can have soft landings for communities that may be affected, and that also minimize outside impacts. So with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Andrew. And now we have Stu Pineglass, again, retired water resource specialist for the city of Westminster in Colorado.
Okay. City of Westminster in Colorado. I'd like to say, you've heard a few people say here today that you're looking at this 30,000 foot level when you're looking at these policies. Well, I'm at the 5,384 foot level, which is where Westminster is. And we actually take some of these policies and create our own to become successful. We've got about 115,000 people in Westminster. We actually serve water to about 135,000 people, about 34 square miles, and we're right in between Denver and Boulder, if you know where they are, on Route 36. People talk about drought. People talk about the importance of drought in water policy. My motto is, a drought is a terrible thing to waste. And we wouldn't have much of our policy if it wasn't for droughts. That is the motivator many times. This is 1962. Westminster had it was a drought. It was horrible water supply. It was bubbles coming out of your faucet. It was really, really bad. The mothers in Westminster marched. They actually burned the public works director in effigy. And so this was a big motivator, since he's the one who makes the water policy. And we really had to decide to go forward and develop a real sustainable water supply. You can see we stopped building permits. We banned lawn sprinkling, and we had to stop using our main source of water. Those are real economic effects. When you have water restrictions, people are out of work. It's not just your lawns go brown. When you stop building permits, people are out of work. With a non-sustainable water supply really affects a community in a real serious way. Our city, as many cities, has a comprehensive plan that shows a whole city. We're lucky in that we're landlocked, so we can sort of see where our city is going to end up. And every piece of land in our city has a land use code, a development type. And we also have a water supply plan. And that water supply plan takes all of our water supply and assesses factors to it for dry years, because we can't plan for an average year. We have to plan for the worst year. Anyone can plan for an average year. And so we have to design a system to operate in the worst year. We put those together by taking a look at the water use by the different development types and the current water use and future conservation and current conservation. We put everything together and we come up with a map like this that shows you where our water supply is going to go in the future. So those are, anything that's raised up is additional water that's going to go to a piece of land in the future. And we do have that water. Our challenge is to take the comprehensive plan and develop a balanced water plan for it. Similar chart you just saw. This is Westminster. This is our water use, and this is our population. Two different scales there, but the point is that as our population has gone up, our water use has gone down. Matter of fact, we increased about 15% in our population up until about, I'm going to say 2016 from 2000, and we have not used any more water. We have yet to, as a matter of fact, reach the level of water that we used in 2000. We had a big drought in 2002 that knocked us down, and we have still not got back up to 2000, even with all that development. When you're talking about putting together sustainable water supply and linking your land use and your water use together, you have a lot of stakeholders. I won't go into them, but certainly some of the important ones are our current citizens and ratepayers. We don't want their rates to go up because of future development. Our motto, and this is key to our success, our motto is to have growth pay for growth. And developers hate to hear that, but it's really important to us that our current citizens are not negatively impacted because of growth. Landowners, developers, they all have their own piece of the pie here as far as their concerns. And it goes down to the region and the state and the economy. All of this is important. We've had to turn away businesses because we said, no, you just don't fit our plan for water supply. And we cannot put a Coca-Cola in Westminster. Not that they came to us to get turned down, but we would have to say no to something like that anyway. There we go. And in all this, we have some goals and tools that we use. First of all, we got to be fair and equitable to everybody. That means new people are going to pay more, or new businesses or new developers are going to be paying more for the water than the people who did before. We've got to, because it costs more now. We have to look at our rate and fee structures. We've designed a rate structure just this year. We implemented it where everyone gets a certain amount of water, especially residential gets an average, but every business is individually calculated. And if they go over that amount in a year, not on a month, but in a year, then they pay extra for additional water supplies that built into the rate system. And it's a very important tool to keep them honest and to keep them creative to stay within their use. Our water plan, our comp plan, we couldn't do it without that. And GIS, I don't know if any of you worked in GIS, but you couldn't do any of this without GIS. You have to be able to take data and put it in a geographic way so that you can aggregate things geographically. I don't know how you do it without it. We do a lot of research, and now other cities are doing more research on actually how much does this type of development use? How much does a residential at 5 units per acre use? And certainly it changes in different parts of the country because of irrigation, but more and more research is coming out, and it's only going to help everybody to be able to put this kind of information into their town's plans. And let's see, I'm not going to go over this, but it's a cycle. There is not, you don't do this and then you put your feet up and you're done. No, you do this and then 5 years, you have to do it all over again because water use changes, because business type changes. You look at old shopping centers are Hallmark stores and shoe stores and things like that. New shopping centers are restaurants. Well, obviously that's going to have a big difference in how shopping centers use water. So this is a process, and it's a continual process, and hopefully being a continual process, it keeps everyone in the game and it keeps everyone learning all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Stu. Yes, let's give him a round of applause. Thank you. So again, just to briefly recap, we're talking about that critical bridging of land and water, right? Because what we're trying to find out here is how we can better meet the needs of people, of agriculture, and of our nature, of our ecosystem, and really what's more important and critical than that. And we have a really great representation here on the panel, both from the local level and the state level. Stu, I want to kind of circle back with you and begin with you. You know, people tend to work, live in silos. But if we were actually able to get people to work together and to communicate amongst themselves, right? What a concept. Then we can work to the advantage of everybody. Instead of it happening in these separate chunks that we're seeing across the board. So can you please tell us how it was done in Westminster, because Westminster actually is a city that a lot of people tend to see and they look at as you have led by example.
Mm-hmm.
How have you done that?
I liked in the previous panel where they talked about, what was it? They talked about having emotions in these conversations, and how does that affect the conversations? And it's there, and that's part of the silos, the emotions, the turf. And we kind of approached it a little differently, and I got to say Public Works is the group that kind of made the first step. And our view is, how can we help you be more successful? And so I started when I was first hired, half of my job was conservation, and the other half of my job was selling water. So I was a very conflicted person. I worked a lot with our building department, and they at that time would develop what we call system development fees, or TAP fees, and would charge the developer for that. And they didn't have a very accurate way of doing it. So I went to them and said, how can I help you make this easier? How can I take some workload off of your shoulders and take that workload for me? It was important for me because that's our revenue they're collecting. It was important for them because they're overloaded. I've never known a building department that was not overloaded and understaffed. And so that was the beginning of trying to get us to work together, and get your foot in the door. And then through that, other people in there, part of the community development department, part of the planning department, and along with that, I got to meet other people. I got to, one of my mottos was, don't send an email if I could walk over there and talk to somebody. These are all little things that you have to think about in order to develop relationships. And developing those relationships alleviates some of that fear and emotion that's there. And getting buy-in from, or building buy-in, I should say, in the city, so that we realize that not one group can be successful. You can't have a successful city development team if you don't have the water for it. You cannot have a successful water team if you don't have the development to go along with it. It really is hand in hand, and it takes a lot of building of trust to get where people can see that. And when you're there, it's a wonderful place to be, but it takes a lot of work to maintain. You can't walk away from that because new staff come on, and I'll guarantee that most cities do not operate that way. And so it's a lot of training to get people bought into that kind of concept.
You mentioned building relationships and trust, and I will say, in previous conversations with some folks in the room, when you talk about developers, you get chuckles and sort of skeptical looks. So how do you work successfully with developers?
Well, first of all, I'm totally honest with them. And we've developed a system for fees from the water perspective that says, this is what it is, this is why it is, very understandable. You can't develop your structure based on something that the average person can't understand. On the community development side, there are a lot of meetings, and one of the things we developed is a pre-application meeting where every department in the city, including police, including the fire, are sitting there. So we all get to talk together with the developers, hear their pre-concept, they haven't submitted anything yet, and give our actual thoughts on it, how we can help them with it, how they could change some things to work within our needs. And if you start from the beginning there, before they've actually designed the whole thing and put it on paper and have something that they can stand behind, let's work together so we can help you design this thing so that it's acceptable for everyone, and we all have skin in the game.
Jim, is that even possible here in Arizona?
Yeah, it is. And I was even thinking, I was going to ask, can I comment on a few
Absolutely.
of your conversation with Stu? And I think certainly in this last one with developers, no private sector person likes their ability to use their land any way they want and the cost to do it to go up. Having said that, what a developer really hates is uncertainty and delays. So if you can give them certainty, if you can give them honest answers, if you can tell them the path, many of them will be easier to accept it. The other thing is there's a big distinction between, generically speaking, right? Individuals are always individuals, but generically speaking, there's a big difference between that small home builder. He's building a couple of houses, or maybe a lot of houses, but he's holding that piece of land for a few months. He builds the house, he's out. And in Arizona, we have a lot of master plan developers. I mean, they own enough land to put a 20,000 person community there. They're in for the long haul. They have a very different perspective. So I think there is that ability, and I think an important thing for us all to recognize, what I would always try to tell the folks that I worked with in the state agency is, we need to realize we are not the decision maker. We're trying to impact that local land use decision, and by and large, that's a private sector decision. The most we do in the public sector is we influence the environment within which they make that decision. And I think simply respecting that can help build the trust and the bridges with developers. The other point I'd make quickly to your first question with Stu is, almost any time I have found a good innovative program, I have found a person like Stu who drove that program to be in place. Someone who got their job done in less than their full time they were willing to work, and then went over the top to do more. I mean, look at who the most innovative communities are in Arizona, and I can tell you why, because I can tell you what person worked there and made that happen. So one of our challenges is how do we, one, encourage and incentivize those people, but the second is, are there ways we can institutionalize? And I think what Stu is saying, that Westminster actually has institutionalized a little bit of a different way of working together.
Who we hire is very important, and that's a big part of how we hire, is based on how we see these people in the past working with colleagues and how they can work as a team. We're really built on teamwork, and my own personal experience is it's much more successful and it's much more fun.
As a foundation officer, our job in many respects is to help advance social change, to try to advance sort of notions of sustainability and really operationalize that. And this idea of identifying and elevating innovators is a real important part of the enterprise, but figuring out how to then scale that is really difficult, because it does often rely on individuals, and so part of that strategy may be building up cadres of individuals, building some kind of exchange between them. Other times it's just trying to get one person to adopt something early so that others can follow. They can see that it works and prove it. Nobody wants to be first. We find that whether that's in the municipal sector, in the agricultural sector, it's really common. Paul was kind of describing similar kinds of traits and characteristics in the last panel, and I think that's just something that we all have to figure out how to do, and it's a little bit of muddling through.
To say the least. Well, referencing muddling through, can you talk to us, and I'd be curious to know in terms of California, what are some of the challenges that you face there in terms of marrying water and land planning?
So I alluded to some of that in my remarks, but we're a state that is fiercely focused on local control, and so most decision making where possible is pushed down to the local level. That certainly holds true for land use planning, and by and large it's true for water as well. And so. But what's interesting is that we push water and land use down to different silos, and so the departments, the people tend to fall in very different camps. And I've hosted actually a number of dialogues between water managers and land use managers over the years, where trying to get them to understand each other, speak the same language, get some cross-fertilization, and some of them get it. People like, I know counterparts of Stu's, who he probably doesn't even know, in California, who really do understand and get this, but by and large, the reward systems tend to be separate. And so because those reward systems are separate, land use planners are often rewarded for, enhancing development. And water managers are constantly trying to just, some of them are rewarded by selling more of their product, which also, add those two things together and you've got a real problem. And so what we have to do is actually realign the incentives for both and make sure they're actually coordinated across each other. That's a tall order, and I think the Groundwater Act that we passed in many ways is a catalyst for making that happen.
Well, how are people looking now? That's one of the things that I wanted to ask you at that relationship between SGMA, that's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, its implementation and the decisions that refer to land use.
So we call it SIGMA. Sorry, I don't know why, but it just sort of worked better than the acronym. But the way in which I think it's really going to play out is, so for the first time in California's history, many regions are faced with a limit on the amount of water that they can use. No longer are they going to be able to mine their way out of droughts, which was creating that downward slope. So from a land use perspective, it's really forcing a conversation among planners at the county level to confront this. It's also starting to have create a conversation. So many county land use planning ordinances don't really actually account for or deal with agriculture much at all. And so that's actually, in some respects, in many places, almost even a separate conversation. What's happening there is many of the irrigation districts, which were originally organized usually around surface water, they're suddenly starting to have conversations about, okay, how are we going to allocate this water, and then how can we create some mechanisms by which we stay within that cap, and where somebody has some surplus, they can sell it to somebody who has greater need. And so inevitably, when you've got constraint, you're going to have markets, and I think that's where a lot of the future is going.
Yeah, just for a little bit of background for those of you that are not too familiar in terms of SIGMA, or the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, it was back in 2014. And it's a plan that requires governments and water agencies to stop overdraft of groundwater and also bring groundwater basins into balanced levels of pumping and recharge. I mean, that just sounds like that's what you want. But that was in 2014. I'm curious, Jim. I know that here in Arizona, programs have been changing, and we have emerging challenges as well, but that have been happening over some time, correct? So walk us through that, and what does that look like right now here in Arizona?
Sure. So, as we did in the brief intro, Arizona put its program in place in 1980, and what the Act put in place was a mechanism, what they call management plan. So every 10 years, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, the idea is there'd be a new management plan, and they would get more stringent as necessary to drive us to a safe yield being no overdraft. The amount of water coming in and out would be the same by 2025. But there are a couple limitations there, because really, for the most part, they were just regulating new uses. There was no ability to. There was a guarantee that agriculture irrigation could continue to irrigate. They were expected to get more efficient, but they could continue to irrigate that land. They could continue to grow the crops they historically grew.
And what about that efficiency?
And so we started down that path, and initially we had language in the statute that said, I won't get this exactly right anymore, but that agriculture had to irrigate as efficient as economically practical is what it basically was. And so there was a determination that meant agriculture could have an efficiency of 85% in their irrigation. The agriculture community never accepted they could reach 85%. After years of battles and challenges, we eventually settled. We took out all the language of maximum and changed it over time. We just said the number is 80%. But 80% irrigation efficiency, and what this means is whatever that consumptive use of the crop is, you can't have more than 20% loss to the environment or to recharge. The plant's going to take up 80%. I mean, that requires laser leveling fields, it requires some pretty precise irrigation. And you can get, if you're in Israel, you're probably going to get to 90 or 95% maybe. But Arizona's still been the leader. But as the laws were passed, and this gets into more nuances, but the mechanism in the law to force that gave enough flexibility that there really wasn't a lot of pressure on agriculture. The main pressure was the belief that they needed to be more efficient, that they laser leveled the field, they could get government grants to do that, but the regulatory pressure that would basically say you don't have enough water to do it really wasn't there. And so really the primary driver on agriculture has been the slowly increasing price of water and basically taking land out of production to grow houses instead. So the really big agriculture question in Arizona, in central Arizona where they don't have firm water rights, and we're just seeing now the effort to move agriculture from CAP water, Central Arizona Project Colorado water, over to groundwater, and to get public investment, public subsidy, I suppose you'd say, to bring back their groundwater infrastructure. And Bruce talked a bit about that this morning. So what is that future, and how does it affect our water use pattern or growth pattern in central Arizona? When we get to the river communities in Arizona, they have the senior rights to the water. And now the question is, and that's more the California situation, what kind of a deal in the long run are we going to find between the cities and agriculture where there may be some sharing? And what's immediately recognized, I think we had a question earlier today, partly in humor maybe, but basically saying for the right price would agriculture sell their water rights? The individual farmer typically for the right price will sell their water right, but the larger irrigation district that may control it will not. And certainly the larger community that fears their water being sold to an urban area some distance away will do their best to stop it. So these are the really big questions and the really big political battles that I think will preoccupy both of our two states' legislatures for the next decade.
Yeah, and there's no question.
Well, you talk about the future, you're talking about the next decade. So, people tend to think about what is happening right now in their lives, that's happening in front of their faces at this very moment. However, these decisions, these policies, these programs, they pretty much hopefully impact the future, right? Of the sustainability of marrying water and land. So my question is, how do you effectively communicate that to the public at large? How do you get people to understand the urgency that is involved when we talk about this kind of issue?
Well, I want to say on a municipal level, it's active conservation programs. It's education programs. One of the things that we learned is that we have to tell our customers about us because in history, the best public works department is the one no one ever heard about because you didn't have any line breaks, everyone turned the tap on, there was water. But we find that's not enough now. You have to educate people about who you are, what service you provide, and why is your bill so high. And that's important for us to educate, get people to understand what's going on right now. We also have to get people involved locally when we develop these comprehensive plans. We need them to say, I really think this should be here or this should be here. So you have a community that's bought into your vision for the city, because it's really the community's vision for the city. We're acting on their behalf. And so you need to include them, and then hopefully when you come to new development, they're not against new development right away. They took a part and they helped participate and design what type of new development is going to be coming in. So it's hard to get people involved in that process, but it's important to get people involved in that process on the municipal level.
If I can, keying off Stu's point for a minute, so one of the talks I would often give, even when I'm still with the state agencies, is I would talk about our need to democratize water. And really what I meant by that was bring the larger public more aware of water issues and the challenges. And historically, you're right, out of sight, out of mind. And historically, we'd go to the state legislature and we'd say, it's water, it's complicated, the water buffaloes all agree, pass it. And 20 years ago in the Groundwater Management Act, 30 years ago it worked. That doesn't really work anymore. There's too many disparate interests fighting over things. And we're moving from an era where we have excess and surplus water and we've got a pie bigger than we need and we're trying to figure out how to divide it. That's controversial enough. Not only is the pie fully allocated and we've got to move it, it's now shrinking. completely different politics. So it's getting more expensive, it's getting more political, and therefore it's going to require public engagement, and hence one of the reasons it gets for a forum like this is we know how critical journalists are to that connection between this information and the public.
Just really quickly, the two investments that that we've made over the last few years that I think are really responsive to this. One is that we've actually started to put a lot more emphasis on collection and dissemination of data and better communication around information and data. There's so much that's out there now. There's so many better ways of actually collecting and disseminating information that we've really tried to put a lot more emphasis on that in everything from the policy environment to innovations and academia and so forth, and even in government. The other is that we've invested a lot in both nonprofits, academics, and journalists on better understanding of crisis communications, and basically trying to actually recognize that even when you're out there kind of talking about a flood situation, it's an opportunity to talk about the next drought, because that's where your recharge is coming from, or that's where your conversations about need for infrastructure is coming from. And so, there's always opportunity to talk about this stuff if you're creative enough about it.
So what I'm hearing is communication and transparency are key when you're dealing with the situation and you're trying to get the public engaged. Now, has that tended to get a little muddy also in the past in terms of relationships with the public and city officials? Have you had to deal with anything like that?
There is politics involved, and communication and transparency in politics sometimes have conflicts.
They don't go well? Is that what you're saying, Stu?
Well, they can, but I think the best politics is open and transparent and good communication. But in the past, I mean, there certainly have been issues, and it takes someone, internal, external, whoever, press, to call it out, and sometimes we can't see it. Sometimes we're so built into our systems of how we operate, we don't see that it's not clear. And it takes someone to call it out for us, and I think that's everyone's job to do that for us.
I think the thing we get, and this is an area where I think both the foundations and the media can help, is water management has tended to be a game captured by the stakeholders. And historically, the stakeholders have been the city's agriculture and industry. It hasn't been the general public, and until very recently, it definitely wasn't the conservation environmental community either, although that has certainly started to
But
change.
it will be.
Well, clearly that's in the West, that's the use that has gotten ignored, and you're beginning to see that shift. But I think that part of the pressure can be, like you said, it's transparency. It's to open it up and make sure we are accounting for broader interest, while still figuring out how to come to recognizing the common ground, because in the end, it's got to be a consensus or we're not moving any of this forward.
So we have a gentleman that's been patiently waiting at the microphone, and I don't want to keep you waiting.
Just still trying to model this behavior of people getting up to ask questions. So we get more people to get involved in the discussion.
You have a
So
question.
I'm Mac from the Lincoln Institute. So the question I have is, and I'm mindful of Andrew's kind of patchwork picture there, where you're showing, the land that's going to be removed from agricultural production, and also mindful of the old model in the West of buy and dry, where cities needed water and they would just buy up the water rights from ranches and others. It happens a lot in eastern Colorado. And a few years ago, we actually did a story in Landlines about a thing called the super ditch. And what it was, I think, actually pure innovation, to the extent that it was a flexible tool that was used to kind of manage water rights in a portfolio as opposed to in individual kind of dichotomous exchanges. Mm-hmm. And the idea, of course, was that not only would you not buy and dry the land, but you would not necessarily use all the water rights if you didn't need them on the demand side. And so the idea was, rather than buy individual water rights, it would pool water rights into a portfolio, and then within the portfolio, they would go into fallowing cycles on the agricultural side. So if the land wasn't up for irrigation that year, they would fallow it, and they might just use dry cropping or something as opposed to just leaving it to go become desert. And then on the demand side with the cities would only use what they needed, and if they didn't need it, they would release it back into that portfolio. It required some kind of active management, but it was actually a way to preserve kind of the agricultural culture in eastern Colorado. This was the Arkansas Valley.
Yeah.
And it was also a way to provide access to water for the cities without kind of, spoiling the agricultural land. And I'm wondering, has anybody looked at that innovation and thought about finding other ways to kind of actually zoom out and think differently about how we manage water rights? And I know we don't want to renegotiate the law of the river and everything because that's just too hard, right? But if we could do it in smaller and smaller ways, and maybe eventually, in our own patchwork, redo the way we think about water rights in larger landscapes. Maybe it's not about us and them, maybe it's not about agriculture and cities, but maybe it's about just active management on both sides.
So I think it's the answer is that it's going to vary tremendously from one basin to another. First and foremost, there are some basins that are entirely agricultural in California, many of them that are subject to the law. Some are sort of have a combination. Very few are really just strictly urban. But the way it's playing out thus far is that many basins are essentially establishing what they believe their sustainable yield is. And so that's sort of like safe yield, but it's a term that's used in California, sustainable yield. So that's how much you have to work with. And then they're allocating out the water rights to all of the landowners, including those who haven't exercised their overlying right. So if you own property and you're overlying an aquifer, you have right to pump it even if you didn't already. It's not a prior appropriation format. So what that means is that everybody's going to get too little water per acre than to do anything. So you'll get maybe 2 feet, and you can't really do much with that. So everybody will then instantly start consolidating their rights. Now that might lead to rotational fallowing, or that might lead to structures, the pooling that you described. Other mechanisms that people have talked about rely more on fee structures, and so everybody not only gets an allocation, but there's fees placed on that, and so you can kind of combine the pooling of fees to buy people out temporarily and kind of do things that way. There's a whole. I think one of the most exciting things about it is that this is sort of a huge laboratory for experimentation on how to manage water rights in a constrained system, and there are going to be as many different solutions as there are basins in California.
And I think ultimately the big deal to be had is some kind of an arrangement between the tribal water right holders, the urban development areas, and the non-Indian agricultural areas. There's enormous potential to define conjunctive management, to share shortages in one way, to share surpluses in another way, to use underground storage, to better develop our effluent. I mean, we could do this in a much more efficient, conjunctive managed way, and I think that's the grand bargain, but there are certainly constraints between here and there, and it's expecting an amount of sort of social guidance over decisions that were traditionally very rigorously held as private individual decisions. And that's the challenge. Governance, are we going to be able to cross that boundary?
It is a funny thing. Water kind of has a history, especially in the West, of actually being a cooperative and collaborative endeavor on the surface water side of things. Because in order to develop surface water, you had to kind of get together and build infrastructure. Groundwater doesn't have that history. I mean, that's just, you punch a well and you're on your property, you kind of use it the way you want, and that's that. So there's some actually interesting cultural barriers and differences between how this stuff is done from one region, one place to another.
I was just going to say, for a municipality who has the individual water rights in Colorado, the important thing for us is the permanence of those agreements, because we can't base a water system on a 5-year deal. We have to base our water system that in the future, whenever that point is, we get that water.
Yeah.
And it might mean we get that water for good. You know, if climate change happens the way it is, we might be counting on that water. That's the difference between having a water right and having an agreement. And so it's very important to us, the permanence of that.
Thank you, Stu. Well, that leads me to this question, how is climate change? Is climate change affecting the way that we're making decisions around water and land planning?
Certainly when we look at our water portfolio, we are always trying to figure out how do we bring climate change into this. And we're looking at Colorado. I'll tell you, we've had some climate scientists tell us that you're going to have more water in the mountains because you have the higher mountains, and there's going to be more moisture in the air, and that snow will fall in your mountains. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I've heard that from some climate people. I've heard definitely from everybody that it's going to be drier and hotter, and you'll have more demands down in the city for irrigation. It's a real balance. I've been to meetings with NCAR, folks in the Boulder area, and they're asking us, well, what kind of information can we give you to help you with your planning? And the level of granularity that we need is not necessarily available yet, because we're working on a basin. I'm in some of the Colorado and some of the Clear Creek Basin, and it's very hard to get to that level of granularity on their data to tell me this is what's going to be happening there. That's kind of why we have a little on one side of the Continental Divide and the other side of the Continental Divide, assuming that if it's dry over here one year, it might not be dry over here the other year. So we're trying to hedge our bets a little bit.
Well, let's talk about Arizona, because Arizona has its own set of concerns and issues when it comes to something like climate change, correct?
Certainly it does. I think, though, that water and our concerns about water and our interest in water is probably the best avenue into that conversation in Arizona. And I spent much of my career in state government knowing that, okay, we aren't going to say the word climate change, but if we can talk climatic variability, if we can talk drought, from an adaptation point of view, we can get people to the same place. Having spent a number of the last years as an elected official for the Central Zone Project, which is the largest user of electricity in the state, it sort of drove me to stop talking that way and to say, okay, that may be fine, but if we want to talk mitigation, we do have to talk about what's causing it.
What was your breaking point?
The recognition that it was time to move that conversation. One, the recognition it's time to move that conversation further along, and I suppose second, that I wasn't working for state government anymore and couldn't, be made, it's not so much to be fired, but be rendered ineffective by going to our state legislature and talking climate change, and they didn't want to hear it. So in part, the personal situation changed, and in part, the responsibilities changed. But I think that Arizona is still barely able to have that really good conversation about adaptation to climate change. They're fine with adaptation to drought. Adaptation to climate change, we've kind of got, the water community's there. The water community accepts it's happening. It's more in the political community we still have to be careful. But it's still a little more problematic to take that conversation into the mitigation role.
Any suggestions in terms of how we do move that conversation forward here?
I'll be curious to hear everybody else's impact, because I think many times our kind of on-the-ground journalists
I just
are
feel,
more at the
for
forefront
those
of
of you who are not from Arizona, Arizona is a really particular place when it comes to our legislature. Just throwing that out there.
Well, it is, but I think it's more. Unfortunately, it's more generally true of the Southwest than we might want it to be. Arizona may be one of the more conservative state legislatures, but this is an issue in most of them. We hear from most of our peers; they have similar challenges. I think that
We'd like to talk about climate change.
yeah. Well, California is, as I say, California hasn't so much connected water and land, but California is clearly way in front of connecting land and climate, and then that draws water in from the other side.
Yeah.
Whereas we're connecting climate and water, and eventually land's going to get drawn in that way. So we're kind of approaching it differently. But I think California is an exception in the sort of western U.S. or southwestern at least in the ability to have that kind of conversation.
Well, we're also we deal with flooding in a much more substantial way than most of the rest of certainly the Colorado River Basin and the Intermountain West. And so we're kind of dealing with both ends, and of course fire, add that in, which connects to water, so that we have the trifecta.
And I think the climate extremes you're beginning to see that change the conversation. Because one of the difficulties we have is, well, hey, we just had a big flood, so it couldn't be climate change. Because most people we have ineffectively communicated so that most people think climate change means dry or warmer. So if it's a wet winter or a cold winter, it's not happening. Well, what it really means is more extreme storms, as Kathy described to us earlier today. I think as we make that communication and people see these kind of storms they've never experienced before, you're beginning, so typically, climate scientists as opposed to the local weather meteorologist, local weather reporters historically have been some of the most resistant to the idea of human-caused climate change. But looking at some of these extremes, I think are beginning to crack that.
Well, and how is that affecting the decisions of the policy making? And we'll get to your questions. I mean, we're talking about climate change and sometimes the resistance to talk about it in certain areas, but at the end of the day, can you talk about, is it affecting the policy or the decisions in your individual states at this moment?
Without question. I mean, I also work a lot, as I said, on flood policy, and we work actually pretty closely with the agricultural community in the Sacramento River Valley, in part because they have huge amounts of land and manage that land for production of rice in particular. There has been a recognition that we can actually accomplish multiple goals all with the same project by advancing protection for downstream communities like Sacramento, by widening the floodplain, modifying infrastructure, creating habitat, while actually giving producers some additional income and additional protection. I mean, it's kind of a win-win-win-win, all driven by this imperative and concern around climate change. Similar kinds of partnerships built up around forest management, where most of our water comes from the mountains. There are partnerships in order to deal with fire, which has impacts on water, and that's, I think you can find stories like that across the West.
Yes, question, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Greg Ramirez here from the University of Colorado, and this question is directed towards Stu. I'm wondering how cities can create land and water policies that don't make it difficult for diverse populations from moving in. And I'm hoping you can provide kind of specific examples from your time at Westminster, conversations that may or may not have taken place regarding that topic.
I'm not sure, can you define a diverse population?
Either minorities, people with low incomes. I feel like they are the ones that are sometimes disproportionately affected by land and water policies.
That is such a tough one. It's Westminster, one of the city council's main goals is to have affordable housing in diverse communities. And when you have land prices the way they are in Colorado at this point, and you have water prices, a single family home, the water price to just get a water tap and sewer tap for a single family home, one home, $36,000 about. That's a lot of money. Now, certainly it gets lower as you go into apartments. So it's one of the things that we've done, and it helps only a little bit. It's really little steps. We just restructured our water tap fees, which is the fee you pay for water, and sewer tap fees. And we restructured them so that smaller units can pay less. But before it was, let's say, multifamily units was one charge. A house was one charge. Now, it's a house based on how many bedrooms you have, or how many bathrooms you have in the house. In the multifamily sector, it's how many bedrooms you have in the unit. So there are some of these like studio units that come on for more affordable housing, but it doesn't answer the question, because now you're talking for one person. You have a family you want to move in. You still need a bigger house. It's such a challenging question, and it's a huge goal for City Council. We've looked at supplying the land for affordable housing, and even when we supply the land, it's a challenge for developers to come up with enough money, and they have to get funding through different federal agencies. It's a challenge for them to come up with enough money to still go ahead with the project. I wish I had a better answer for you. I don't know if other states have found any better solutions.
That's a good question. That's a good question. I want to keep it moving so that we have an opportunity to receive audience questions. So please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Laura Pascas. I'm a reporter in New Mexico. And I feel like this question kind of goes to your panel, but it could probably go to any of the panelists who've been speaking today. We're talking a lot about how sort of this bigger message, whether it's about science or management or the law of the river, can better reach the public through journalists. And I understand that, but I also, as a reporter, I spend a lot of time talking with rural communities or people in cities, farmers, people who only hear about a project, for instance, like an application for a permit to drill for groundwater. They only hear about water issues at a certain point in the process, oftentimes when it's far too late for them to have any meaningful input into a project. So I'm curious how institutions and municipalities and NGOs are doing a better job of listening to the public now and in the future, and how we can do that better. Thank you.
Maybe, a couple kind of things I'd suggest, because that is a big problem, and that's of course a generic problem. Anyone covering local issues or an elected official or appointed is familiar with, at the last minute when you're in the final vote, suddenly the public shows up with a significant problem. And so it's always an issue. But I think one of the kind of techniques there, and it's certainly something we're interested in at Lincoln and Babbitt Center, is how can we do visioning processes for communities? So we're thinking about, I'll be kind of glib about it, but what does Arizona want to be when it grows up? Or what does a particular county want to be? And so this might be like a comment Pat Mulroy made at the 10X conference the other day, where Southern Nevada Water Authority has a 50-year plan, and every year they update it by adding the next year to it. But long-term visioning, where you can bring the community in and you can get the media to cover it. So Envision Utah would be an example from over a decade ago, I guess now. But anyway, that could be one technique of getting these processes out there so the general issues get better understood.
Transparency and communication.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's also a matter of governance. This can often be a governance question where, can you create a structure for whether you're undertaking a planning exercise or some regulatory effort or what have you, where you can actually get meaningful engagement of the public. I think too often times the public process is just merely a complaint window and not really a two-way street. And so I think that does often harken back to governance. So, some of the innovations that are taking place now in California on that are some of these groundwater management agencies are building in much more robust and meaningful public input opportunities early on in the planning process, as opposed to notice and comment, which is really virtually useless.
Stu, I see you.
I agree. We also, much earlier in the process than it used to be, we get our GIS again and we draw a circle around the potential development, and we send a letter to or we require the developer to send a letter to every one of those, and they have meetings. If there's interest, I say. And I say if there's interest, one proxy I'll use is when I raise fees on developers. 6 months, or not 6 months, 3 months ahead of time, I send out a letter to every active developer that we've worked with that says we're going to be raising fees. Then we have our first council meeting, probably 2.5 months before to approve the fees. No one shows up. They approve the fees at the first council meeting. The second council meeting, which you have to have in order to make the law effective, now you got 5-10 developers there complaining about the thing. They were notified 3 months ago, and they don't wait until it's a crisis. And I think the public is not a lot different than that. I think they wait till there's a crisis. They have plenty of things they're thinking about, and this is not a top of their list. And I think that's how, especially nowadays, we operate on crisis. You know, if it's not a crisis, it doesn't get our attention. And so, but the best we can do is educate, notify, and get people involved in the process as soon as possible.
Just wondering, Zach, how much time do we have? Okay, so just really briefly, gentlemen, a minute each. If you want every single person in this room to have one takeaway from this session, what would you like that to be?
I guess, I think we're hitting it on the end here. I think governance is the biggest issue. And, you know, I mean, whether it's these immediate issues or, you know, if you read things like collapse, right, what causes societies to fail, we all get environmental threats and social threats thrown at us all the time. It's when we lose that resilience and ability to govern ourselves that we come apart. And so I think that really is the challenge. And I don't have an immediate answer to that, but I think that is a place where the foundation community, the NGOs, the journalist community, and everybody else can try to work together and figure out, and by governance I mean bigger than just what does our local government do, but how do we manage these issues in a way that we engage enough people?
Yeah, I think we've got to stop glossing over the problems and actually really confront them. I mean, I think just being honest with one another is a really important place to start. We can fool ourselves so easily. We like to do it all the time, and I think just actually confronting the challenge and actually sort of having enough spine to step up to it and take your best swing at it, I think is I mean, I know that all sounds a little bit Pollyanna, but I think that's kind of got to be the way we function as we go forward. I think it was said earlier on one panel, and that for me that's what jumps out.
And I think we all live on budgets. We've got a land budget, we've got a water budget, we've got an environmental budget. And if we don't take an active part in working with these budgets and solving these budgets, they're gonna work out on their own. You know, we're gonna get to the end of the land, the end of the water. We're gonna screw up the environment, or we haven't already, and it will get resolved whether we choose to do it in a good way or not.
Yeah, the enemy's not each other; it's physics.
And with that, we shall end this conversation. Jim, Andrew, and Stu, thank you all so much for your insight.
Thank you.
And thank you also to the audience for your questions.